Good afternoon. Yeah, I remarked as I came in that this is one of the few titles of a lecture which is almost as long as the lecture itself. But there's a kind of reason for it which will become clear. I want to take very briefly take two kind of epigraphs for this talk. The first is from Herman de Vries himself. We'll come to that in a minute, to who he is, etc. But he says, "Our searching gaze and watchful steps merge." And here's a passage from a poem I actually came across only a couple of days ago. It concerns three Scottish keepers. That's men who spend their lives walking the wild valleys and the lochs, looking after the fishing and looking after the deer. The line from Norman Mackay goes this way: "They read the landscape as I read a book. They missed no word of it. Foxhole, strange weed, blueberry, ice scrape, deer's hoof print. They saw what I saw and more, and meaning. They spoke like a native, the language that they walked in." I think that's a wonderful line. They spoke like a native, the language that they walked in. The poet Mackay is drawing here on a very ancient tradition that the human is at one with the natural landscape and with natural objects and their relations to each other, that humankind is part of nature itself. What is nature? A view of nature is a proposition about the world. The business of art, wrote D.H. Lawrence, is to reveal the relation between man and his circumambient universe at the living moment. Art and science alike register or reveal aspects of the human relation to Lawrence's circumambient universe, and the ideas and perceptions that works of art and of science convey and which shape our view of nature are subject to constant modification and change. To put it another way, every scientific discovery and development, however great or small, and every work of art, in whatever medium, changes to some degree our consciousness of the world in which we live and our attitude towards it. Nature is neither things nor processes. It is the complex of their dynamic relations, a complex which necessarily comprehends the relations of human beings to the natural world of which they are a part. That we human beings have our human being, what Heidegger termed being on the earth, within and as part of that complex of relations, of biospheric interrelations, is an idea of nature and human nature that held sway in primitive and in classical societies, and which has been revived in the late 20th century. But for nearly 4.5 centuries, the epoch since the Renaissance, we have lived with the implications and the consequences of a very different scientific and philosophical worldview. It is a view that has seen itself as confirmed by advances in mechanical technology, what we call victories over nature, and take note of the military metaphor, which have been generally regarded not only as extending human possibilities of understanding, but also the consequent possibilities of an increasingly successful economic exploitation of the natural world. Modern Western civilization, thus armed, notice the military metaphor again, has run roughshod over every kingdom of the natural world, animal, vegetable, and mineral, arrogantly claiming to represent an imperative at once imperious and imperial, the necessary imperative of increasing prosperity and the unceasing progress, what our Western governments call growth. From the beginning of this dominance, ideological and practical, there have in fact existed other views, other voices, contrary voices, but until recently they've barely been heard in the clamour of progress, and when acknowledged they have often been contradicted and dismissed. Climate change denial and its political manifestations in the leading industrial societies is the most recent case in point. You will all be familiar with that. Among the most compelling of these contrary voices in recent years have been those of artists. In particular, those who have worked in various ways within the landscape and with natural objects. I want to tell a story. It involves two Renaissance thinkers, a modern philosopher, and a contemporary artist. The artist is Herman de Vries. He is Dutch, but for many years he has lived in a small, undistinguished Bavarian village in an industrial farmland landscape, but close to a large forest, which is in itself, however, but a tiny survival, a fragment of the great European forest which stretched from the Alps to Scotland. The Bavarian forest, near where he lives, is called the Steigerwald. Herman de Vries calls this his studio. It is where he goes to gather materials, to make work, to think, and more importantly, perhaps, not to think. Oh, I apologize for the quality of this particular image. It's part of a work. It is a photograph of Herman de Vries, whom you've just seen sitting at a table in his garden. Sorry. And it's of him in the Steigerwald. The work consists of this photograph and a text. I went into the wood to think something, but forgot to think and didn't find it necessary to draw any conclusions from this. We shall return to this. I want to talk a little bit now about de Vries, one part of his work. The whole lecture really is about a very small part of de Vries's immense output. It's not really a lecture about de Vries alone. But I want to talk about de Vries and his work at a place called Digne-les-Bains. It's a small town in the Maritime Alps in France. In the summer it's a spa town, in the winter it's a ski town. And something remarkable was already underway when in 1998 de Vries was first invited to Digne. He was invited with a view to creating work in the area around the town, to make a publication and to create an exhibition at the local museum or art gallery, the Musée Gassendi. The invitation came from the imaginative and energetic director of the museum, a woman called Nadine Passama Gomez, on behalf of the Center for Art as Research into nature, hereinafter Cairn. The centre pioneers creative collaboration between the museum and the National Geological Reserve of Haute-Provence, an extensive, a huge national park of mountains, valleys, rivers and streams within which Digne itself is situated. Cairn focuses on the promotion of contemporary art as a means to deepen public understanding of the natural world as a whole and an awareness of the ecological richness of the region of the Great Geological National Park. De Vries is an artist whose life work has concentrated on the human consciousness of the nature of nature. In terms of both its informing ideas and its practical program, Cairn chimed closely with De Vries' own personal philosophy and practice as an artist. It was in this respect a perfect organization within which De Vries could work. It had already sponsored work in the National Park by a number of internationally significant artists, including Mark Dion and Andy Goldsworthy. Digne and the Reserve offered an ideal terrain in which De Vries could develop a new body of work responding to an environment that was very, very different from the flat Dutch coastal polders of his early life and from the intensive agricultural surroundings of his home village of Eschenau in southern Bavaria, or from that of his nearby forest studio. De Vries made his first visit in 1999, April, and began at once to explore the surrounding mountains and the valleys, collecting earth and plant samples and prospecting sites for possible works. From his first visit, he had determined that as part of his commission from Cairn, he would create a sanctuarium in the National Reserve. De Vries' art concept of the sanctuarium is of a sanctuary for nature itself, a space totally protected from human interference and depredation. His sanctuariums consist typically of some small piece of land enclosed in such a way that no human trespass is possible. What happens in such a space? What is propagated, what grows, what vegetation is succeeded by what, is a consequence of natural processes. Each plant grows from seeds carried by the wind, by birds or by other creatures. Each is fertilized by the action of bees and other insects, able to enter a space made inviolate to human beings. Each sanctuarium is then a little wilderness. It is what it is. It is not an experimental project or a preserve or a reserve with a scientific or conservatory purpose. It is a work of art, a symbol. It is emblematic. It presents us with an image for contemplation. It is also real. As De Vries would say, it is the thing itself. Our idea of wilderness, incidentally, is usually related to an idea of scale. De Vries reminds us that every modern wilderness embodies an idea whose true meaning is not to do with scale, but with the sense of reverence for the beautiful actualities of any unspoiled natural terrain free of excessive human interference and depredation. Or may be inspired by the vastness and wildness of the great wildernesses, mountains, jungles, deserts, the Arctic and the Antarctic. But we may also feel something closely akin to that when we look down into a rock pool or look with a magnifying glass into the mold that covers a woodland floor. There is no wilderness left on earth, however vast or small, that can survive without protection from resource exploitation and without a delimiting barrier to unauthorized interference. That is to say, without becoming what is essentially a sanctuarium. The first of De Vries's sanctuariums, 1993, is situated on a grassy knoll, there it is, of unutilized ground at a busy road junction in Stuttgart, the rich city of Mercedes and the motor car, and consists of a circular enclosure of pointed steel stakes, each resembling a Roman spear with a gold spearhead. In this protected space, the ground is safe from the city maintenance department, whose task it is to tidy up and destroy weeds. It is a tiny wilderness, an exemplary or emblematic sanctuary for nature. Such plants and wildflowers as colonize it will be left in peace, such as trees as will seed themselves there will grow to a height that natural circumstances will determine. What happens in this untouchable little domain is visible to all who cross the road and care to look. To those speeding by on the road, it will be as below notice and insignificant as any piece of waste ground glimpsed through a car window. De Vries's next sanctuarium, built for the second decennial sculpture project in Munster in 1997, is a perfectly circular brick wall with no entrance to an inner sanctum, which is visible through 4 oval oculi, eye-like holes in the wall at eye level at the cardinal points, the nominal directions of the winds. Writing of this work, De Vries emphasized the specifically spiritual dimension crucial to his concept of the sanctuarium. The word comes, he writes, from the Latin sanctus, sacred, holy, venerable, inviolable, untouchable, exalted. Sanctio, to sanctify, i.e., to make inviolable through religious consecration. The ground in the sanctuarium is then not merely an ecological reserve protected against human interference, it is also to be regarded as a holy ground, a place to be revered. The idea thus introduced, and that it is seen through one of the oculi, the idea thus introduced of natural sanctity and reverence for all kinds of life, utterly free of all convention or dogmatic orthodoxy and from economic exploitation, is central to the whole of De Vries's artistic and philosophical project. Its intellectual and spiritual sources may be found in all human cultures, and it finds secular philosophical expression in a text De Vries quotes from the great modern philosopher Wittgenstein. What is mystical is not how the world is, but that it is. That of which we cannot speak does exist. It shows itself. It is the mystical. The wall of the Munster Sanctuarium, being perfectly circular, without beginning, without end, is an image of everything and of nothing. In the park Géologique, De Vries explored the wooded mountains in the valleys above where the river Besse runs fast through a spectacular narrow gorge, and found what he was looking for at a place called Roche Rousse, or Red Rock. Here, high above the valley road, were the remains of a ruined farming hamlet that took its name from the distinctive reddening of the limestone rock faces in the locality. Here in times past men had lived and worked, now the place is deserted, nature has reclaimed its ground. As De Vries has written, all change brings chance, change, c'est la vie, without change, no chance. Nature gives, and takes. The derelict limestone buildings that had been built into an overhanging rock perfectly suited de Vries's purpose, for its present loneliness and desuetude were poignant reminders of the vanity of human wishes, of the truth that all things shall pass, and that human purposes and human habitations find their place as natural events and interventions within the natural cycle. The sanctuarium at Rochereuse encloses with gold-tipped pointed railings the crumbling ruins of the farmhouse, at one point passing through an original masonry wall, thus preventing any further access to them and allowing them time to complete their ruin without human intervention, and protecting the plants that will grow without disturbance within the palisade. De Vries declared the forest woodland around the sanctuarium le bois sacré, the sacred wood, and its boundary is marked on each of the pathways, approaches to the site itself, by steel stakes sharpened like spears with gold tips. Each of these emblems of protection has inscribed on its shaft the word silence. Silence is also a form of protection to wild and natural things. As the visitor approaches the sanctuary, they induce a sense of ceremony and occasion. They induce the solemnity appropriate to the place and its meditative purposes. What distinguishes the sanctuarium from the other works of this type is the richness and complexity of its natural and historical and artistic context, and also, as we shall see by the happy chance, a particularly appropriate philosophical association. To reach the sanctuary requires a rugged and demanding walk up through woods, a discipline that is itself a preparation to the meditation appropriate to the work itself. And this walk is itself conceptually and practically a part of the total work. Not far from the sanctuary, on a fragmentary boulder, close to the path, de Vries has set a simple carved inscription in gold, Ambulo ergo sum. It is barely visible on this, but it can be seen more clearly. Another version also created by him. By this point, having walked up the path, very long walk, very steep, you may well have a sense of self as embedded in the physical experience of the body itself of a very acute kind, and it serves to confirm the truth of the observation at its simplest level. I walk, therefore I am. Now the proposition will be recognized immediately as a contrary riposte to the dictum of René Descartes, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, which is, for reasons that will become apparent, the most famous single statement in Renaissance and pre-modern philosophy. It was first enunciated by Descartes in his great and famous treatise, Discourse on Method. And then again in Meditations on First Philosophy, first published in 1641. Ambulu ergo sum, I walk, therefore I am, is often misattributed to the scientist and philosopher Pierre Gassendi, who, as you may remember, after whom you may remember the museum in Digne is named. Pierre Gassendi, a vastly learned European intellectual, who was born actually in 1592 in the tiny hamlet of La Grave, close to Digne, inside the borders of the National Geological Reserve. In fact, the statement is not by him at all. It occurs as a provocative and sarcastic reduction by Descartes himself of Gassendi's objection to the cogito principle, the principle that I know that I exist because I think it to be so. Before publishing his Meditations, Descartes had circulated the manuscript to trusted friends and learned fellow philosophers and scientists, including Gassendi, who had been a great friend, inviting objections and comments. These objections and Descartes' replies were appended to the first edition of the great book, the Meditations on First Philosophy. Gassendi had written in objection to the cogito ergo sum argument, as restated in the second meditation, by first paraphrasing Descartes' own formulation. This is Gassendi mimicking Descartes. I am, I exist is true each time you pronounce it, or that you mentally conceive it. But, he continues, I don't see that you need all this mechanism when you had other grounds for being sure, and it was true that you existed. You might have inferred that from any other activity, since our natural light informs us that whatever acts must also exist. This down-to-earth response to Descartes' agonistic mentalism was powerfully and dismissively repudiated in the great philosopher's scathingly sarcastic reply. When you say I could have inferred the same conclusion from any of my other actions, you wander far from the truth, because there is none of my activities of which I am wholly certain in the sense of having a metaphysical certitude, which alone is here involved, save thinking alone. For example, you have no right to make the inference, I walk, therefore I am, except insofar as our awareness of walking is a thought. And from the fact that I think that I walk, I can very well infer the existence of the mind that so thinks, but not that of the body which walks. So it is in all other cases. It is a magisterial put-down. Against the mechanistic dualism, mind versus body, of Descartes, thus logically deduced, Gassendi adduces the truth of an empirical common sense grounded in the experience of everyday actuality. This sharp edge of Gassendi's objections and the sometimes acerbic brusqueness of Descartes' responses to them are indicative, of course, of a gulf between the two thinkers whose approaches to reality are fundamentally at odds. In his objection, Gassendi addresses the great philosopher playfully as, "O mind." In his reply, Descartes sarcastically responds to his antagonist as, "O flesh." This bitter exchange between Gassendi and Descartes effectively ended their friendship for many, many years. Excuse me. Descartes is the extreme advocate of the deductive approach to reality. He's the natural philosopher of absolute doubt, bent on the rigorous testing of knowledge by the reduction of inquiry to first principles. Hence the title of his book, Meditations on the First Philosophy. It is what the mind itself deduces that discovers truth, leading on the resolution of logical problems to absolute certainty. Interestingly enough, for Wittgenstein, perhaps the greatest modern philosopher, the opposite was true. the resolution of logical problems leaves us on the edge of a great mystery. Gassendi, on the other hand, was committed to the assiduous gathering of facts and their investigation by inductive observation of material phenomena, skeptically arranging them to create an undogmatic picture of how the world might be, a picture that might change with each new discovery. De Vries was delighted to discover that so sympathetic and historical figure as Gassendi should have close connections with Digne and have been born within the area of the reserve. The significance of Gassendi, the polymath, philosopher, astronomer, and scientist, lies not in the immediate logical cogency or otherwise of his objections to the second meditation, but rather in his humane skepticism and his passion for nature. After his many journeys to different parts of France, to Flanders, and elsewhere on intellectual business, Gassendi always returned to his native valley. In my story, he stands for a feet on the ground materialism, an insistence on being as primarily corporeal. And he stands also for a conception of phenomenal nature as experienced through the senses, through subjective engagement and empirical observation, rather than as something apprehended a priori, whose reality is validated through logic. Gassendi's mode of operation, intuitive, experiential, empirical, based on sense and sensibility, is in this sense closer to, or perhaps analogous to, that of modern philosopher-artists such as De Vries, Richard Long, Hamish Fulton, Giuseppe Pennoni, and others. There is, however, a deeper point than simple commemoration to De Vries's inscription of ambulo ergo sum on a rock in the middle of the sacred wood. Descartes' cogito ergo sum and the dualism it predicates, in which mind and body are conceived as separate and the mind placed in ascendance over the body and other material creation, is the clarion call of the Enlightenment. Its original formulation in the Discourse of Method is followed by an elaboration in the last two sections of that work, in which Descartes sets out to demonstrate that birds and beasts, and by extension butterflies and insects, not to mention the lower orders of plants and fungi, are nothing more than natural automata, mere things without mind or soul or feeling. And he asserts the ineluctable dominion of man over all animal, vegetable, and mineral creation, which awaits its further and more successful exploitation by man as a consequence of new sciences and more effective technologies. Here begins the modern certainty of technological and economic progress. For the laws of physics, he wrote, caused me to see, this is Descartes, that it is possible to attain knowledge which is very useful in life, and that instead of that speculative, that is to say the metaphysical, philosophy which is taught in the schools, we may find a practical philosophy, i.e. one that is scientific, based on mathematics and physics, by means of which, knowing the force and action of fire, water, air, the stars, heavens, and all the other bodies that environ us, as distinctly as we know the different crafts of our artisans, we can in the same way employ them in all those uses which are adapted, and thus render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. The new arts and crafts, by which he means the various new technologies, which have continued to develop ever since Descartes. These new arts and crafts will enable us to enjoy without any trouble the fruits of the earth and all the good things to be found there. It is a view that has given philosophical heft to those who have found and continue to find divine sanction in that most oft-quoted and influential of texts, verse 28 of the first chapter of Genesis. And God said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." This has been and remains the key justificatory text for evangelical capitalism at its most brutally exploitative, and of capitalistic evangelism at its most crassly arrogant. This masculine language of use and employment, of mastery, domination, possession, is that which has accompanied not only vast improvements in the material lot of mankind, humankind. We've all been beneficiaries of technological advance and practical improvement. But it has also justified and continues to justify the systematic despoliation of the planet, the destruction of its physical integrity, and the rape of its natural resources. It was a language inscribed also in the crude economism of state communism. It justifies the most brutal industrial agribusiness, monocultural agribusiness, the crude exploitation of natural energy reserves, and collective agricultural economies where small-scale farming had previously obtained. It continues to inform a great deal of destructive and entrepreneurial and industrializing effort in every continent of the world, apart, at the moment, from Antarctica. Crucially, the Cartesian formulation frames a conception of the natural world as other or alien, a place to which man has come, has seen, and must conquer. Finally, wrote Descartes, "I shall deal with man because he is the spectator of all." This division of the spectator from that which is surveyed opposes the objective observing of the world, which is essentially separate from the surveyor, to a subjective being in the world, being within nature, in which observation is part of that being in the world, and which shapes and colors what is observed. In the former Cartesian view, the eye is conceived as a window between the primary reality of the mind, and the secondary reality of the external world. Hence, among many things, the importance of optics to the Renaissance physicists, and of perspective and the camera obscura to the Renaissance artists. In the latter, which I here associate with Gassendi, the latter view, the world is conceived as primary reality, a reality of which we are an actively embodied part, a place where we find, in Gassendi's words, the truth of existence. It is precisely the idea of the eye as a surveyor. Surveyor is a good word. It links the political cartographer, busily portioning out the world for political possession, and the prospecting mineralogist, busily measuring and checking the world in order to check what kind of natural reserves can be exploited. It is precisely the idea, as I said, of the I as surveyor that links Cartesian dualism to the exploitative distancing of man from nature that characterizes the art of the picturesque, with its emphasis on the processes of composing the prospect, that which is seen. The world presents itself to such an observer as precisely a picture. The picturesque is concerned not with the actualities of nature, but with the satisfaction of a premeditated desire to see it in a certain idealized light. This was the premise that underpinned a great deal of landscape painting from the 17th century to modern times. It's actually, I think, visible at the moment at the Royal Academy. And the creation of landscape gardening and the idea of the park, in which nature, as we might say, was paradoxically tamed to look wild. Mass tourism, the basis of an essentially destructive but short-term profitable economy short-term profitable economy for many parts of both the first and the third world, so-called, has always been based in large part on the principles of the picturesque. Hence, the significance of the camera, with the primacy it gives to the objective and reductive single viewpoint to the modern tourist. Contrary to its intention, the holiday photo of a building or a place bears nothing of the reality of being in the place. Descartes' use of the term environ, which you may remember, is also significant, for it anticipates the widespread use of the term environmentalism to describe that species of conservation that, for all its well-being and its many small political victories, nevertheless perpetuates a spectatorial view of the world, a perspective or prospect which separates the human beings who are at its center from those phenomena in all three of the natural kingdoms that surround them. This human-centric view accounts for the persistent and reactionary environmentalist division of the world into designated territories, with regions for industrial and agricultural development given priority, but with allowance made for the preservation of marginal nature reserves, national parks, and touristic wildernesses. Environ, Old French, meaning to surround. Hence, there is man, the spectator of all, and there is the world that surrounds him. You may remember that for Lawrence, in contrast, in my epigraph spoke, and my first sentence spoke of the circumambient universe, that is to say, the universe that walks round man. So it is by appropriating ambulo ergo sum, turning Descartes' sarcasm on its head, De Vries affirms the unitary subjectivism of what has come to be termed deep ecology, in which the phenomenological has precedence over the analytic mental. The experienced subject is part of the living world and the world about him, and cannot be separated from his experience of it and within it. Above all, he is most certainly not the master of all his surveys. He speaks like a native the language that he walks in. The word silence on the spears that protect the sacred wood around Roche Rousse now takes on another meaning. Silence, writes De Vries, gives us the opportunity to experience a new kind of sensibility. It gives us another, better opportunity for contemplation, experience itself. Language is a formidable resource, but it creates divisions in the unity of our existence, between you and me, between here and there, between man and tree, between tree and forest. In silence, division disappears. Solitude gives us the chance to experience unity. Now we may recall, I went into the wood to think something, but forgot to think, and didn't find it necessary to draw any conclusions from this. This is profoundly and pointedly contra Descartes. It amounts to, I do not think, therefore I am. This non-assertive presence of being within the landscape is something de Vries has celebrated in the works commissioned by Cairn in the country around Digne. There are many of these in a diversity of media and means, but I want, on this occasion, to concentrate on the latest. These are interventions of the most tactful kind, small texts in the nature of ambulo ergo sum, engraved on rocks and stones, signs of a philosophy that is empathetic to natural process. They are so modest, says de Vries, that you can easily overlook them. They should have no impact on the landscape and nature that is of such great beauty that art can easily be a disturbance. Further, there have been places in the region that have been sacred forests in ancient times, places of human relationship that I think worth indicating and recalling. The inscription of these subtle and unobtrusive texts, such as this one, which you may see on the rock in gold, art vivens, art is living, is from Giordano Bruno. These signs, de Vries calls traces, most of which have recurred over the years in de Vries's numerous statements and writings. So it's at once an act of homage to nature and to the culture of unintrusive and sympathetic human interaction with the natural world. We may think here with particular point of the ancient inscriptions and signs of rock art, of those charcoal marks made in the nearly inaccessible darkness of caves. Traces include such inscriptions as this one, Giordano Bruno's art vivens, art is living, and nature nunquat, era, nature never errs. Gassendi's existentiae, the truth of existence. Elsewhere there is the familiar de Vries watchword, chance and change, or a sequence of elemental questions for the wayfaring walker. Qua? What? Pourquoi? Why? Do? From where? Vers où? To where? This may remind us of that great painting of Gauguin's. Where have we come from? Where are we? Where are we going? Recently, he has made inscriptions such as this one, which you've already seen, in the rocks and quarries around Eschenau in the forest, making an invisible bond between the spirit of his home landscape and that of the other landscape of his heart in Haute-Provence, up in the mountains above Digne. In the sacred woods, in the ruins, rocks and quarries, in either place, the walker may chance upon, as you've seen, ambulo ergo sum, or the Sanskrit saying that adorns the capping stone of the circular sanctuarium at Munster. Around the concrete cap of the circular sanctuarium in Munster is written in Sanskrit, as here on a rock in the Steigerwald. This is perfect. Perfect comes from perfect. Take perfect from perfect. What remains is perfect. On rock faces in both the Steigerwald and the Reserve Géologique, he's also inscribed in places the mysterious Latin palindrome, which was found incised at Herculaneum and at Pompeii and found in graffiti across the whole of the Roman world. And sometimes this is referred as the Sator Quadrat, Sator Arapod Tenet Opera Rotas. Roughly, one could say the sower, no work, opera, backwards, keeps the work going round. It can be read from left to right, right to left, and top to bottom, and bottom to top, and may be said to mean something like, what goes round comes round. The cycle of life is unending. Elsewhere, there may be the mathematical sign for infinity, or the Hindu sign for Om, and other characteristic texts and quotations, as once it was in German, to be in English. In certain places in the Reserve Géologique and in the forests of Fayafeu, high above Digne, and in the Steigerwald, De Vries has placed on stones and rocks or on the masonry of certain buildings a small engraved dot of gold. You see it is on the lower part of the rock. Each of these constitutes a virtually invisible point on the surface of the earth. Its positioning is random, having no topographical or historical significance. Beyond its presence as a marker of De Vries's respect and love for the terrain. Gold, which is the crucial constituent of the traces wherever they're found, in Digne and Echenin, is used for its intrinsic beauty as a pure mineral element, for its ancient sacramental significance, hence the gold tips of the protective spears of silence, and also as a reminder of its usage as an index of value in its broadest sense in the cultures of East and West. Each gold dot might also be seen as making an axis point at the junction of the sacred 6 dimensions of which the Hopi Indians defined a human being's presence on the earth. The 4 directions of the wind, downwards into the earth and upwards into the sky, an idea that has haunted De Vries since childhood. Everything represents the continuum, he wrote in a sketchbook in 1990, in which we ourselves are a point, a continuum point, the continuum itself. Here at this point in space, we encounter the modern philosopher I have mentioned once before, Wittgenstein, for whom silence is preeminently the beginning of an apprehension of things beyond words, of that of which we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent, is the last proposition of Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus, Wittgenstein's first great book on language and logic. Of that of which we cannot speak, we must be silent. These small gold points in the landscape are quite specifically related by de Vries to another somewhat gnomic proposition of Wittgenstein. A spatial object must lie in infinite space. A point in space is an argument place. In this, however, these tactful and modest dots represent not arguments of the kind propounded by men in favor of their mastery and possession of the finite and measurable earth, but rather the material actuality of space itself, its infinite reach into every dimension, including that of the imagination. They are not of the nature of the professional surveyor's point of distance, the mark made to demarcate a territorial boundary, or the limit of a geological prospector's measuring chain. Rather, they speak in gold of the earth's own claim to be heard and respected, encountered in their settings, embedded in the mineral earth, surrounded by grass and trees, open to the sky and near the flow and sound of water. These points in infinite space invite silence, reverie, contemplation, and meditation. Such a point in space might be anywhere or nowhere, at any place, seen or unseen. Its argument, so to speak, is a musical note in a song of the earth that has no beginning and no end. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll have time for a couple of questions. Okay.
I wondered if you thought about the contradiction of artists face who try and make work protect the environment. Surely, no matter what art you make in the environment or whatever art you make, you're still using materials, you're still making an action. I wonder if you thought about that.
The question is about that whatever you do, you're still using tools, you're making an action in some way upon the earth. Inevitably so, is the answer. But the point has to do with the function of the action. These are indeed actions, but they are signifying actions in the sense that they have no, like all art, they have no purpose. That is what we might call useful. They exist to provoke thought, to provoke feeling, to incite, if I can put it that way, or provoke meditation, contemplation, or whatever. They are so tactful that, of course, if you went to the hills above Digne, I can be pretty certain that you would not find any of them or see them. They are very, very small, as I said, tactful. Tactful, of course, comes from the Latin to touch. They touch the earth lightly. They don't harm the earth. Nothing in the geological park could possibly be harmed by any of these interventions. I think that is the difference. And in fact, your question is a very good one and a very pointed question, because actually it is the difference between that signifying action, that emblematic inscription, and all the other acts of the kind that we've talked about that derive from that tradition of thinking, which was formulated most clearly and cogently by Descartes, which is the formulation of an idea of domination, of human dominion.
Those actions seems very romantic. Those actions seems very romantic. Those artworks seems very romantic in the kind of way, Caspar David Friedrich was romantic, which it's always a problem for me, because the grandness of nature in those works is always measured in relation to the subject, to the man standing there, and the freedom of nature is only measured in relation to this point. The infinity of nature that you talk about is still measured from maybe not a rationalist kind of point of view, but still measured in relation to a subject, to a thinking subject.
To a human.
To a thinking subject who defines ways of measuring, which always looks to me like a little bit of a contradiction.
Yeah. The question is to do with the fact that any such action, any such inscription, any such mark still relates, our friend thinks in a way that relates to Romanticism, to the subjective individual in relation to the world, to which one can only say, of course that is true, but I can't see how we can do anything about that. The human is in a relationship. What is crucial, I think, and in a way my lecture only touches this in the most superficial way, what is crucial has to do with this change of attitude, or rather this philosophical change, and it is essentially a philosophical matter, of the idea of nature itself. The key kernel of that change has to do with how can I put it? The position of the observer. I could like it to the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty. Heisenberg principle is that nothing is observed that is not anything that is observed is changed by the act of observation. I think what modern contemporary artists working with nature, especially these particular artists that I mentioned, have done has been to actually revolutionize the way in which the artist relates to. I think the picturesque, that there are elements of picturesque in Romanticism, although historically, the picturesque develops out of a kind of neoclassicism and the idea, of the prospect and the view and so on. But actually, that idea continued to feed into some extent into a certain kind of Romanticism and a certain kind of continuing idea of nature as a kind of wonderful other. The key in our own culture, I think the key philosophical turning point here is probably with Wordsworth. And the greatness of Wordsworth, no emotion now she feels, she moves in Earth's diurnal range with rocks and... I'm sorry, I'm mangling it. No motion now she sees or hears, and there's something that she sees. She turns in Earth's diurnal round with rocks and stones and trees. This is a poem from a group of poems called the Lucy poems. The magical thing about these poems is that what he does with the child that has died, the young woman that has died, is to place her within nature and thereby takes her out of the idea of the figure of nature and the figure against the ground of nature. She becomes, the figure and the ground merge. And there's something very crucial about that in Wordsworth's own poetry, this change of attitude. But you get it, I suppose, this is why I said, among those the most important philosophical contributions made to this change of attitude have come from artists, and alongside modern and contemporary scientists, who have, that's where I think it moves from the romantic idea of subjective experience, right? A subjective experience, in a sense, based upon objective observation of the world, how beautiful the world is, etc., to something which is much more profound and much more, in a way, difficult of articulation, but very, very crucial to the way in which, as moderns, we approach the whole business of our relationship to the natural world. This recognition of our embeddedness, if you like, within it, as us part of it, and our observation as not being an observation that is separate from the thing observed, but part of a process in which we are part, of which we are centrally a part.
One last question. We're running very, very late. One last question. I was just going to ask if you follow on from the other questions.
Could you, I'm sorry,
Sorry, if you follow on from the other questions, that there's the violence implicit in these interventions in the landscape, and also you spoke about, probably goes back to questions, you also spoke about things being, the works being emblematic, and I wondered if you could talk about perhaps the two strands of the Muse's work. So the first circular sanctuaries in relation to the more subtle later pieces. I mean, the first one
Yeah.
seemed quite, that seemed to me very much about possession, and although his intention, you were saying, was kind of admirable, that actually by imposing, it's such an imposition of landscape.
yeah. Well, first of all, these are but two bodies of work, if you like. There's a great deal of other work by Herman de Vries besides these, but all of the work really turns upon the notion of the thing itself, that instead of drawing or photographing a thing, he presents you with the thing. So many of the works of what he calls the real works, or the real things, are actual things taken, from nature, are simply presented as they are. There is a coherence, I think, between the sanctuariums and the traces, and it is this, that in both cases it is nature itself which, in a way, the traces simply are there to be encountered. And as I said, they are so tactful and so lacking in any kind of impositional force, as I said, to be virtually invisible. The significance of the traces is, in fact, the fact that I've told you about them. You know, they're not works of art you're going to go and see. That's the significance of them, that you know that they exist in this place, and that is enough. You know, which itself, you know, is at odds with the notion of the art object, especially the commodifiable art object. So that's one thing. The thing about the sanctuariums is that where he's made them are places where there's a huge, has been in one way or another, significant, not huge necessarily, but significant human interventions in the landscape or townscape or whatever. And so again, the purpose of the sanctuaries is not that anybody possesses the land thus enclosed, but that nobody but nature possesses the land that is enclosed. You know, that nothing is planted there, but that is planted by the birds or the insects and so on. It's about
I mean, so that that's his intervention is relatively minor.
Yes.
His intervention is relatively minor in comparison to what's gone around.
The intervention is minimal, really. It encloses and stops you stepping on it. And it may have, as in the one in Munster, which is in a park, funnily enough, it actually is it stops anybody ever again trying to landscape that piece of ground. But being built as it is, as a circle, as a ring, and so on, and having these eye pieces through which one can see it and so on, it is itself a symbolic object in the park.